Good afternoon and good morning, depending on where you are. I'd like to welcome everyone to the third and final session of our Global Webinar Series 2024 on the theme Key Considerations in the Energy Transition, a spotlight on infrastructure, gender, and governance. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are. It's a great pleasure to have you all here. My name is Sadhika Shashi Prabhu, and I work with the United Nations Environment Programme in the Disasters and Conflicts branch based in Geneva, Switzerland. I'm a legal officer under the partnership between UNEP and the Government of Norway. The primary objective of this collaboration is strengthening national capacities to reduce environmental and pollution risks associated with the oil and gas sector. Our work now increasingly looks at promoting dialogue on the energy transition, especially with a focus on social, environmental, and governance aspects of this transition. Our work involves delivering technical assistance and training to countries, as well as undertaking global outreach activities that address environmental safeguards in the energy sector. Our annual global webinar series aims to spread awareness and encourage multi stakeholder dialogues about the latest developments in the energy sector. Given the growing global consensus to phase out fossil fuel dependency, and with COP28 laying the groundwork for a just and equitable transition, this year our webinar series chose to focus on the energy transition, specifically highlighting the enabling social and environmental conditions. Our first session looked at the role of technology and infrastructure in driving energy innovation. Our second highlighted the vital role that women are playing in decentralized renewable energy solutions. And finally, our third session today is titled Make or Break: How the Right Mix of Laws and Policies Can Enable the Energy Transition. This one will look at the role of governance. Despite international consensus, the success of the energy transition to a great extent hinges on creating a comprehensive legal landscape that empowers renewable energy development, one that considers all aspects from implementation to operation to stakeholder management, while simultaneously addressing environmental and social dimensions and considering potential disaster conflict risks and its safeguards. Today, we hope to have a discussion that highlights common legislative roadblocks that countries encounter as they navigate the transition and how to overcome these. The conversation will focus on mechanisms that encourage mini grids and net metering and emphasize the importance of undertaking environmental impact assessment and regular compliance monitoring. To ensure that we have a wide range of perspectives, we will be hearing from the development sector, the government, and the private sector. Each of our panelists have first-hand experience in this field and will share their key learnings. Before we start, I just wanted to go over some logistics of the GoToWebinar platform. Please remember that this is a recorded webinar and will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. We encourage audience participation and ask you to send all your questions and queries into the chat box. We will try and answer as many of them during the question and answer session. Feel free to type in. Unfortunately, we will not be able to give you the floor given the time constraint, but please send in your questions. I also want to let you know that on the bottom right hand corner, there is the option to switch on captions. If you are struggling with audio connections, you can do that to still follow the webinar. Um, I would also like to remind you that you will receive a certificate of participation if you stay with us until the end and fill out the webinar evaluation form. Please also find the PowerPoints as well as the bio of our speaker uploaded in the handout section. Without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to welcome our first speaker, Rhoda Washira. Rhoda Washira is the head of the Energy Unit in the Africa Office of United Nations Environment Programme, where she leads initiatives aimed at advancing the adoption of renewable energy and enhancing energy efficiency across the continent. She joined UNEP in 2013 and has extensive experience working on green economy, sustainable consumption and production, and resource efficiency in Africa. Prior to this, Rhoda served as an economist in the government of Kenya and as an analyst in the UK Department of Transport. She holds an MSc in economics from the University of Warwick and a BSc from the University of Leicester. We're so glad to have you here, Rhoda. And over to you. Rhoda, you're on mute, just to let you know. Thank you.
All right. Sadika, can you see my screen?
Yes, yes, Rod, I can see your screen. If you just go, perfect, and I can hear you as well. Thank you so much.
All right. Perfect. Oh, thank you very much for having me here, colleagues. My name is Rhoda Washira, as Sadika said, and today I'll give you a very brief presentation on what UNEP is doing to advance renewable energy in Africa. As an outline, I'll provide a brief introduction, some context of the region, how UNEP has been supporting some renewable projects in Africa, a few selected examples, some insights from what we have seen as we implement some of these projects, and then I will provide a conclusion. So UNEP supports countries to advance on renewable energy and energy efficiency through various projects and initiatives. Mainly, UNEP collaborates with both the public and the private sectors to foster sustainable markets for renewable energy. UNEP also implements individual projects and programs that support development of policy frameworks, principles, and networks of practice to support the advancement of renewable energy globally. UNEP also provides support to countries in their efforts to achieve low carbon and climate resilient development pathways. In addition, UNEP does engage with various countries to develop resolutions. So for example, during the United Nations Environment Assembly, various COPs, and the African Ministerial Conference that focus on promoting clean energy solutions. So, in context, what does Africa look like? When we come to working in Africa, we find that the energy mix is about 50-50. So we have 50% fossil fuels and we have 50% renewable. When we look at the renewables, they're not really the modern renewables that you'd want to see, but they are renewables. As we look at the evolution, we find that the biofuels have continued to grow over the years. It's followed by oil and gas, as well as natural gas, probably informed by some of the deposits that have been found in the region. So, what does it look like on the ground? When we look at access to electricity in Africa, it's about only 43% of the population have access to this. This is quite a challenge given the population is actually growing and the countries need to move faster to provide access to electricity. We find that North Africa is on average better off, between 60 to about 100% access, whereas Central Africa, for example, parts of the East and the West are still struggling with about 59 and below percent with access to electricity. In Africa, 80% of the population relies on traditional biomass for cooking. So cooking has always remained a challenge for the continent, even after working on it for many years. 500,000 deaths per annum are linked to indoor pollution due to some of these cooking resources. So UNEP work in Africa on energy. We do support developing countries to improve energy efficiency. So a lot of work is done on energy efficiency. In this presentation, you'll find that there's not much on efficiency. I've focused mostly on renewable energy as one of the other paths that we actually support. We support countries in this as part of their efforts to achieve low carbon, climate resilient development pathways following their various commitments. In Africa, UNEP has been able to support regional and national initiatives to advance this agenda. Normally, we focused on policy support, legal and regulatory frameworks, mostly at national level. We supported countries to develop roadmaps on renewable strategies and so on. We've also supported financing, so access to climate finance for countries to be able to tap into this climate finance so that they can be able to invest in some of these renewable targets. We've also supported environmental and social impact assessments, some capacity building, as well as knowledge management and sharing of best practices, mostly on the South-South cooperation, but also on North-South cooperation. Notable projects in this area, we can highlight the geothermal projects, solar projects, and wind. I'll give you a few examples on this so you can see some of the work that we have actually done in this area. So on geothermal, UNEP played a pivotal role in advancing geothermal energy across Africa through various initiatives. The most notable here would be the African Rift Geothermal Development Facility, normally dubbed as ARGEO. This was established in 2003 and aims to promote geothermal energy investments in the region and reduce reliance on fossil fuels across the African Rift. with about $4.75 million in funding from JEF, as well as support from Iceland. Argeo has managed to advance geothermal development across the countries. I think we can all agree that the country that has mostly advanced on geothermal here is Kenya, and since we have a speaker on the panel as well, I'm sure they'll be able to highlight some of the legal and regulatory areas that have actually ensured that this has grown over the years. This project mostly focused on surface explorations. For example, in Tanzania, where we looked at the Ngozi geothermal prospect this year, trying to see how Tanzania can also advance its targets and its resources on geothermal. It has expanded to include additional countries that were not or additionally not there, for example, Malawi and Zambia. And a lot of these countries do attend some of these conferences, for example, the Argeo conference scheduled for the 21st to 25th October 2024 in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Here we bring the countries together to get to share best practices and get to understand how best they can be able to support each other in this space. We've also supported direct use geothermal applications. For example, UNEP is supporting a clean energy project in Kenya to boost sustainable energy and support climate smart agriculture. So here is looking at greenhouse gas emission, pasteurization, drying of grains, and so on. How can we use this resource to also directly benefit the communities and create some livelihoods here? Capacity building has also been extended to Djibouti and Tanzania, for example, through South-South cooperation. So, for example, we got a team from Djibouti to come and learn from Kenya on how they can be able to advance the drilling on geothermal. Moving to solar, solar has proven to be very attractive in the region. It's one of the most upcoming renewable technologies. And since this has improved over the years, we're seeing a lot of uptake in the region. But then we find that the continent, it has a lot of unreliable and costly grid electricity, leading to businesses tapping on fossil fuel generators. So not only businesses, even households, because of the unreliable electricity, we all have some generators that you can be able to tap when the power goes out or when the power is not so reliable. We find that renewable power clean captive installations offer a more cost-effective and environmentally friendly solution. So we are trying to push for clean captive installation vis-a-vis the fossil power generators. This is a NICI funded project. Now we funded a couple of projects that were through grants, and they mainly covered capacity building, the upfront costs for developers, and so on. The project demonstrated the financial and economic viability of clean captive installations and aimed to provide a model for clean energy adoption in Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, and South Africa. For example, in Ghana and Nigeria, this activity was actually done on hospitals. So, of course, hospitals, as we all know, they require stable electricity. A lot of them do rely on generators. How can we reduce the amount of generators and hence fossil fuels that are being used? So the solar uptake was very good for this. They have a backup batteries, and they installed the solar and it works quite well, and the cost did go down for the final consumer. So the uptake for that project was also very good, and I think there will be a phase 2 for it, and we'll see how we can be able to add more countries to such projects. The other interesting project I can give here is on wind. So this was a joint SDG funded project in Mauritius. We find that Mauritius, as an island, they are quite reliant on imports of fossil fuel. So for these countries to try and become more energy secure, they're trying to tap into the renewables that they already have in the countries. So Mauritius is actually trying to achieve a target of 60% renewable energy by 2030, up from 40%. About 23.9% of electricity is from renewables. Here is normally hydropower, but gas, some solar, some wind, and some landfill gas. And the rest does come from imports of fossil fuel. The other interesting things that Mauritius has a 2.3 kilometers square exclusive economic zone. And this is an area that they can be able to tap for this offshore wind. So the government is very keen on ocean renewables, and offshore wind was identified as the most advanced technology that the country can actually be able to invest in. So through UNEP support and in collaboration with DTU Wind, a feasibility study for offshore wind farm was undertaken. It included a lot of techno-economic analysis, location identification, and estimation of levelized cost of energy. Here we managed to look at two hypothetical wind farm location and the potential for example, a 100 megawatt offshore wind farm in Mauritius is actually a possibility. The finding of the study were presented to cabinet and they were adopted, and the proposed area was actually set aside for future development of an offshore wind in Mauritius. A conceptual design was also done during the project. However, the next step here is a detailed environmental and social impact assessment. So when we go to the countries and try to discuss the next steps, these do become a challenge because they can identify private developers or the private sector to come and do environmental impact assessment. But they also require the capacity for the government officials who will be reviewing these assessments to be able to understand and make the right decision for the country, for this generation, and for many generations to come. So this is a gap that we find in many countries that are trying to do new renewable energy projects in areas that they have not done before. So some insights from our implementation. We find there's a lot of execution challenges. Countries have beautiful targets. They are ambitious. They want to go into renewables, but then the implementation does become a problem. Infrastructure in Africa and the debt burden is quite high. The transition to clean energy is impeded by the infrastructure and the debt burden. The aging infrastructure and inadequate transmission lines are really posing a challenge to the countries. Financing is the biggest problem that we find on the ground. We try to support countries to access some of the climate finance out there, and also how to try to be able to package some of these so that they can be able to attract investments from outside. So Africa really does need to explore the climate finance mechanism. But one of the things we also find that is a barrier here is the policies that are in the countries, the legal and the regulatory framework to be able to attract some of these financing mechanisms are actually lacking in the continent. As I'm sure I will hear a lot of this today, policy and regulation, this needs to be scaled up. Effective policy, legal, and regulatory frameworks are essential, but currently are inadequate. Lessons from different countries can inform best practices and improve execution. We can learn from each other and ensure that we don't make the same mistakes somebody else made to ensure that we're actually moving faster in this transition. And of course, African landscape is very complex. The shift to cleaner energy, coupled with environmental concerns, the issue of resource governance, a growing youthful population, hence the need to create jobs. These green jobs are really needed by everybody, the politicians, the parents, everybody is looking for green jobs. So if you can get a project that can actually bring jobs, then that takes priority in the region. So these present both an opportunity and a challenge. So in conclusion, Africa's energy landscape is at a pivotal juncture, presenting both significant challenges and transformative opportunities. To harness its potential, the continent must overcome critical barriers, including inadequate financing, outdated infrastructure, complex policy frameworks, and so on. Addressing these issues through robust investment in clean energy, enhancing regional integration, and implementing effective policy reforms is crucial. By doing so, Africa can not only meet its burgeoning energy demands, but also lead the global transition to sustainable energy, driving economic growth and environmental stewardship for the future. In this area, we can also point out the resources, the minerals, the critical green minerals, depending on where you come from and what you call them. These are in abundance in Africa. How can Africa be able to tap into some of these resources to ensure that they support the transition in the continent is one of the biggest issues also being discussed when we go to various meetings in the region. The continent's youthful population and vast natural resources position it uniquely to become a central player in the global energy ecosystem, provided that strategic actions are taken to resolve current obstacles. That's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rhoda, for a very interesting presentation. And I did have a follow-up question. So much of your experience is continental, and you have that your perspective across the continent. So I was saying, when it comes to solutions and the energy transition, how much should the continent look inwards? So what is being done to look at increasing local engagement, local stakeholders, as well as regional integration? Um, and do they hold a lot of solutions to the energy transition for Africa, and from your perspective?
Yes, thank you very much, Sadika, for that. Yes, I would think there's a lot of potential and a lot of goodwill from the region. When you talk about regional collaboration, you find the regional power pools are there. Some are working better than others. The South Africa power pool is quite strong. We can all learn from this and see how best to support the policies that actually encourage some of these regional integration. When you talk about stakeholder engagement, I can give you an example. For example, in Mauritius, they have to go step by step, and they have done that. They involve everybody in the process because, in the end, if you want something to succeed, then you have to involve the various stakeholders. The only thing we find challenging is the implementation of it. So you go through the policy development part, engagement stakeholders, then when it comes to implementation, that's where the blockage is. And I think some capacity support can be provided here, some exchanges of best practices, learn from each other, can also be used to encourage some of these countries not to give up, but also to keep going on this journey.
Um, Thank you so much. I actually do have a few follow-up questions, but I will save that for the end. And thank you for your presentation. Now over to you, Mr. Kihara. Uh, Mr. Kihara, Mungai Kihara is the Deputy Director of Renewable Energy at the Energy and Petroleum Regulatory Authority, Kenya. Mr. Kihara's work focuses on geothermal, wind, solar, and small hydropower policy and regulation development. He has also worked on feed-in tariffs policy, renewable energy, mini-grids, green hydrogen, energy planning, and net metering. He has a wide experience in public sector, having worked in the energy sector for a duration spanning more than 15 years. Mr. Kihara holds a Master of Energy Science and Policy from the Ajao University in South Korea and a bachelor's degree in Mechanical and Production Engineering from Moi University, Kenya. Over to you, Mr. Kihara.
Thanks very much, Sadika, and welcome to this webinar. I'm here to discuss with you policy and legal framework on renewable energy with experiences from Kenya, and I hope I'll be able to deliver to your expectations. So before we go to the policy and legal framework, I want to give you a highlight of how electricity system in Kenya is, starting with geothermal, where we started in 1981. Rhoda had mentioned that Kenya has really progressed in terms of geothermal. In 1981, we had only 45 megawatts. Currently, we are almost in 1,000 megawatts. We also have hydro. Our system has been based on hydro for quite a long time. But with the climate change, this has been becoming an issue. So there's a move toward geothermal. Of course, there's now wind, solar, biomass that has come on play, especially supported by the feed-in tariff policy. We have seen quite a number of solar power plants, four of them are coming on board. We have a biomass power plant, 2 megawatt of it, generating using biogas, and we have one of the biggest wind power plant in Africa, like Turkana Wind Power, and also another one, Kipeto Wind Power, coming on board. In addition to that, Kenya also imports power from Uganda and Ethiopia, and that is now our interconnected system. But in addition, we have what we call off-grid systems for those areas that are quite far away from the grid that cannot be connected using our national grid. In total, Kenya has about 3.3 gigawatt of energy, but the demand is growing, so we are seeing a process where more and more of solar, wind, geothermal coming on board to support our system. Our typical generation looks like this. You can see geothermal contributing about 41.7 percent of total generation in a typical day. Wind is about 13 to 14%. We have hydro about 24.7%. We have solar contributing about 3.5%, and we also have imports in Uganda and Ethiopia. In addition to that, we have double power plants that really support us during peak time. But with time, we have seen the government now focusing more on renewable energy and have put a target that by 2030, we need to have a system totally based on clean energy. Now, when you talk about renewable energy, even landscape, we have quite a number of them, and the most important one is Energy Act in 2019. Of course, before this, there was another act, and an Energy Act came in place really to bring on board the new constitution framework. We have the Energy Policy 2018, on Energy Act. We have talked about feed-in tariff policy, and we are also working on drafting renewable energy policy. We have mini grid regulation, mini grid guidelines, and with that we have the mini grid regulations. We have net metering regulation. We have developed green hydrogen guidelines and power undertakings. These are electricity licensing regulations. All these are here to support our renewable energy sector in Kenya. I'll have a discussion on them one by one. And we're starting with the Energy Act. This act came on board to consolidate various laws. I had said we had the 2006 Act, and also taking on consideration the new constitution in 2010, which put two levels of government. So we had to change our act to bring on board the need to have two levels of governance in Kenya. This also created a more comprehensive and streamlined legal framework on energy. And what you have seen is an improved clarity, efficiency, and investment attractiveness. Through the Act, a number of regulations have been developed. Some are in the process, some are being signed, some are in the process of being signed. But with that, we have also seen some challenges that come with the implementation of the Act. And one of them is the bureaucratic handles that we usually have. The Energy Act itself took almost 7 to 8 years from development to the final signing off by the president. The regulations that the authority has been developing has taken also some time. This because the constitution has put in place some issues that have to be done, and one of them is public participation, which is really key in any development of any act or any regulation in this country. We're also talking about limited resources. The process, for example, of developing the regulations need two key areas. One is regulatory impact assessment, and also the public participation. These two areas are quite expensive to do. So with that and the limited resources that we have to focus on which areas to focus on. Then there's overlapping jurisdictions. We have two kind of acts, Energy Act and Environmental Act, both addressing renewable energy, and this may bring some confusion and potential conflicts. In this, for example, when Energy Act talks of promoting biomass, and the Minister of Energy is promoting what called fast-growing trees. So with the fast-growing trees, you wonder whether it's Minister of Environment or Energy, Minister of Energy should focus on. So this confusion sometimes brings some issues. And the other one is on outdated regulations. We have seen the Energy Act has brought some other regulations. One particularly is on what called system operations. This helps in grid integration and interconnection. So this is under development at the moment, but the older act didn't have this. So these are some of the issues that we have seen coming up from Energy Act. To develop the Energy Act, we had to come up with the Energy Policy 2018. The policy objective was to ensure affordable, competitive, and sustainable renewable energy supply at least cost, while protecting the environment. So the issue of environment here is very important, and we have seen some successes that come with it. One of them is increased renewable energy generation. The Act is very, very focused on making sure we have increased our renewable energy resources. This is coming from geothermal, hydro, wind, and solar. We have seen that in my previous slide. Also, on it, the energy policy 2019 has really assisted us to increase our electricity access. the issue of net metering, and mini grid regulations have really helped us to open up the rural areas that have been mainly marginalized without access to electricity because the national grid could not reach there. So with the policy, we are able to develop the mini grid guidelines and open up these areas. Some of the challenges, and I've mentioned this, integration of renewable energy has been an issue. With the focus too much on renewable energy, the power systems now becomes an issue to manage. There's also the emerging technologies. We have seen renewable energy keep changing. The energy sector keep changing. So we have to keep our energy policy up to date with these changes. We are talking about battery storage, for example. These are some of the technologies that's coming in, and we have to make sure we work towards that end. And that currently, Minister of Energy is working towards reviewing this policy so that we can be able to integrate the new and emerging technologies. Now talk about renewable energy power plants to the grid. These have been supported mainly by renewable energy policy. This policy is an instrument for promoting generation of electricity from renewable energy and allows producers to sell renewable energy generated to the off-taker. Currently, we have only one off-taker in Kenya at a ceiling tariff for a period of time, about 20 years. So here, the developer is able to sign a PPA with Kenya Power and sell power for the next 20 years. So the objective is to have investment security and market stability for investors in renewable energy sources, and also encourage private sector. So before 2008, when they enacted the feed-in tariff policy, we had very few investors investing in renewable energy, but the feed-in tariff policy really encouraged them to come on board and invest in renewable energy, and also to manage their power plants prudently and efficiently to maximize on their resources. We have also seen the policy encourage local investment from also the local investors participating in power generation. Initially, we used to have quite big power plants, and very few could be able to participate in this. But the policy is able to integrate small investors and able to do small power plants and be able to earn from generation of renewable energy, electricity from renewable energy. A key element on this policy is the requirement that all power plants, all developers have to take ESIA on proposed development. In fact, one of the conditions for approval by the authority is to have ESIA license from NEMA, National Environmental Management Authority. Some of the challenges that we have seen in the feed-in tariff policy is the long lead time on review. As I said, renewable energy keep changing, so they need to integrate this. But we have seen we have not been able to review this as frequently as we could, and that's bringing a lag on that. Then, as we get more and more investors, there's a need now to move to renewable energy auctions. So we have had to transition from the feed-in tariff to renewable energy auctions. But this has been a challenge, especially how do we handle only the investors that have gotten the approval to continue with their investments. And then recently we had a moratorium by the government on signing of new PPAs. Although this is almost being lifted, but we had a period where we have not seen new investments come to renewable energy. On mini grids, we have mini grid guidance currently, but we also have drafted the mini grid regulations as required by the Act. And the objective of this guidance or the regulation themselves is to get the private sector development of renewable energy in mini grids and give necessary certainty and confidence to private developers. Also, this is also assisting us in increase access of electricity, especially in rural areas where we don't have the national grid. And also in these rural areas, we have abundance of renewable energy. Lake Turkana, where area is located, is quite far from the national grid, but it's also connected to the grid. But that locality has a lot of renewable energy, including solar. So this helps us also to take advantage of the resources that the country has. I've mentioned also as part of development, all mini grids being developed are required, and this is within our guidance and also regulations to take ESIA and let's get ESIA from our NEMA as the authority governing on the licensing of environmental assessments. Some of the challenges that we have seen is we are yet to enact the regulations. This has taken some time. Also, that means we cannot really regulate the way we really want to regulate. Although we have issued the guidance, there's a need of this regulation being enacted. Then there's the challenge of what happens when the grid arrives in the mini grid area. This has been very well documented in the regulation, but we have seen the regulations are not yet on board. The other thing, and Rod has mentioned about captive power plants and net metering. This has been guided currently by electricity national regulations for captive power plants. And in June this year, the cabinet secretary of the minister in charge of energy in Kenya gazetted net metering regulations. So the objective of this is to support development of renewable energy power plants for for own use and also to sell and access the grid. Net metering regulations themselves allow captive power plants to connect to the grid and bank the excess energy that they are able to generate in the grid. And they also, when they need this power, they can draw that power from the grid. Of course, part of process to make sure ESIA is done and get the lessons from the authority. Some of the challenges that have come to see is that most of these captive power plants and distributed generators have not been captured in electricity plants. So this becomes a challenge for the off taker. Then there's a need to finalize the captive power policy that governs how all these power plants will be developed. So we see here net meter regulations came before the captive power policy. So there's a need to streamline this area. Then we have seen the distributed licensee. In Kenya, we have one main one, Kenya Power, is yet to adopt the new framework. As I said, the net metering regulations were signed in June this year. We are still working with the licensee to make sure those who are willing to connect to the national grid through the net metering framework can be able to do that. One of my final slide, we talk a little bit about the green hydrogen. This is a new area Kenya is really focused on. We have seen green hydrogen can be able to abate some of the hard to abate areas like agriculture, transport, and such. So Ministry of Energy is very keen on developing the green hydrogen as an energy carrier. So they have developed the strategy, and the authority, we have developed the guidance on green hydrogen and it's developed, and sorry, not development, but derivative guidelines. I think the main thing here for our discussion is on sustainability criteria for green hydrogen derivative, and also give the relative statutory requirements, standards, and monitoring mechanism for these projects. The main objective of this guideline is to assure investors and developers of green hydrogen derivatives of level playing field and certainty in the regulatory environment. A key highlight on that sustainability is the production of green hydrogen should be done sustainably, focusing on electricity, water, land, and local communities. When you talk about electricity, we are saying green hydrogen may not be produced where people still don't have access to this electricity. When you talk about water, is that people get water before we start industrial processing of water to get green hydrogen. And that definitely is key to make sure people get to use their land, especially for agriculture, before the other issues of green hydrogen come in, and also taking care of local communities and their needs of where these these projects are being developed. And as part of sustainability, developers need to undertake ESA on the proposed developments, and also a need to provide the annual license to authority as part of environmental compliance. And this annual license that we're talking about is a NEMA license that is required for us to check on the compliance of this green hydrogen project. I'll leave there with one of our big power plant, Geothermal power plant in Lokalia. When you can please have a visit on this. It lies within the national park, so you also get to see a giraffe also as you visit our power plant. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kahara, for a very interesting presentation and breakdown of what's happening in Kenya. I actually did have one follow-up question. Within these frameworks, is there any and these policies, is there any way or sustainable way of ensuring that the produced renewable energy does not get lost due to a lack of infrastructure or poor infrastructure? So things like faulty transmission lines. What are the ways that the laws and policies are kind of meeting that capacity
Thank you very much, Sadiq. Yes, that's very key. Currently, we are having quite high, energy losses in our power system. But most of these are not really technical losses, but commercial losses that we are trying to manage. But when you look at the technical losses, the government set up a company called Ketaco. As part of the policy, Ketaco is mainly to build and operate the transmission network. With that, we are able to open up other areas. Lake Turkana Wind Power, the line from Lake Turkana Wind Power, 430 kilometers were done by Ketraco. Some of our areas in Western Kenya are still having some constraints, and Ketraco has been able to use lines and substations that actually reduce this loss of energy that we can be able to do. So the government has put a lot of resources in that, and now they have also developing a policy on PPP framework on transmission line, noting that the debt ceilings can be a little bit challenged and resources are also scarce. So we are bringing private sector to assist us in building these transmission lines. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kahar. More for you at the end of our question and answer session. And welcome, Christian. We have with us Kristen Betalon. Kristen is responsible. He's the business development at Cube Energy, and he's responsible for managing strategic partnerships and overseeing the development and execution of large-scale and complex infrastructure projects. In addition to this role, Kristen also serves as the business engagement lead at Peace Nexus Foundation, driving efforts to integrate conflict sensitivity into corporate investment practices. His career spans over a decade at the United Nations, with assignments in countries such as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Cote d'Ivoire, Somalia, as well as the UN headquarters in New York. He holds a master's in international law and humanitarian affairs from the University of Aix-en-Provence and a bachelor's in political science from the University of Sherbrooke. Over to you, Kristen.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks again. It's a pleasure to be here today and sharing some of our insight, from the work that we do at Cube Energy, and thanks to UNEP, and I think also with the support of NORAD for the invitation. I think I'll just going to be very brief about Cube Energy. But Cube Energy is a renewable energy services company. Our mission is to deliver, clean and reliable energy solutions, particularly in fragile and conflict-affected settings, where the need for sustainable infrastructure is both urgent but also challenging. We are very active in South Sudan, Somalia, and Central African Republic, and had projects also in the past in Kenya. But our vision here is really to provide fully financed turnkey solutions. So for that, we develop, build, and actually operate solar-powered mini grids that can provide affordable, reliable, and clean power to communities and businesses in regions where the national grid is either absent or really dysfunctional. So the areas where we operate are often characterized by four elements. Energy infrastructure are poorly developed, either because part of the countries have been marginalized by development initiatives, or infrastructure have been damaged by decades of conflicts, and this has led to very high prices for electricity. But that said, conditions are usually very great for renewable energy. Solar, wind, or hydro, often one of these, can work very well and present several benefits. And I think also there is usually a very strong appetite at the local level to support any initiative that will help electrifying and powering development. And this appetite is often translated into very tangible support and facilitation by local authorities or communities. However, implementing renewable energy projects in these environments present a unique set of challenges, and especially when navigating the complex web of political and regulatory uncertainties. And I think this will provide you a very contrast presentation compared to what Mungai just said before regarding the current state of Kenya regulations. Here we will look at very difficult and very challenging sets of environments, and I think this can be characterized by three key areas: regulatory uncertainty and policy gaps, political instability and risk management, and institutional capacity and project implementation related challenges. But before going into details about this how we navigate these uncertainties at Cube Energy, I just wanted to give you a concrete example and sort of like take these pieces of challenges through this example. So let me give you a concrete example and take you to Baidoa in Somalia, where Cube Energy, together with its partner Cross Boundary Energy, has built the first ever solar hybrid power plant from foreign investment. And I'm going to use this example, as I said, to comment on the challenges. Baidoa is a typical regional capital of a conflict-affected country, where climate change and extreme poverty have displaced people from rural areas, and the city has grown with a great speed. When you look at the urban growth of on the map there. And it currently hosts also around 300,000 IDPs across the city, putting a huge burden on the infrastructure of the city. And I think the energy infrastructure actually are very limited. Only a few diesel generators operators have established grids in part of the city, but the lack of investment capital and also technical expertise to establish more sustainable infrastructure for electricity, this has resulted in many people that do not have access to electricity, and the prices remain very high. We're talking about like around $1 per kilowatt hour. And so Cube Energy has started operation of this newly constructed solar power plant in March this year. Is the largest investment from an international investors in the renewable energy sector in Somalia. And I think the biggest of its kind connected to the United Nations compound. The power plant will also, connect different, public buildings, government buildings, hospitals, and also connect to the local grid through a local partner. However, despite the needs for electricity and the fact that the necessary investment capital in general are available for energy project, I think the fragile and conflict areas are traditionally perceived as too risky and too complex for investors. I'm just going to touch about the regulatory uncertainty and policy gaps. One of the first hurdles we encounter in fragile settings is the absence of clear, cohesive, and regulatory frameworks. In many cases, the policy environment is either incomplete or outdated and lacking the specific provisions required to regulate the renewable energy investments. And in Somalia, for example, while the government has expressed strong support for renewable energy at the state, but also at the federal level, there was a lack of comprehensive national energy policy historically. And this has made difficult to assess the risk and plan for long-term investments. But this began to change, and over the course of the project, and actually early this year, just before commissioning our power plant, there was a comprehensive national electricity code that was approved by the federal parliament, and they're actually now articulating, the specific provision for the implementation of this code. But prior to that, companies like Cube had to navigate a sort of like a patchwork of local, state, and federal regulation and practices, could have changed rapidly depending on the political climate, especially when you operate at the state level and not necessarily in Mogadishu. So it means that you also depend on sort of like political dynamics at the state and between the state and the federal level. And I think in this context, the environmental and social aspects of the project, by the way, there was no regulation in place. So we follow IFC standard and did a very advanced work in trying to sort of like bring international standards and use some flexibility also to apply them in the context of Somalia. And I think generally this unpredictability can lead to delays in project implementation and create barriers to scaling up renewable energy infrastructure. And I think the absence of a robust policy on also on power purchase agreements, PPAs, for example, made it challenging to establish formal agreements that are enforceable and also bankable. When you look at the political instability and risk management, it's another significant issue in fragile settings. And again, in Somalia, the political environment has been shifting unpredictably with regional power dynamics and security concern constantly evolving. This introduces significant risk for infrastructure projects that require long-term stability. Changes in local leadership or political alliances, for instance, can lead to the reassessment of previously agreed upon contracts or project terms, and that cause, again, these delays or disruptions or even outs, the project development. And I think, just to give you a concrete example, to navigate this uncertainty, Kubernetes are focused primarily on three strategies. Innovative financing. So we have leveraged the presence of the United Nations as an anchor client that allows us to access cheap capital and mitigate some of the risk of like unpredictability around off-taker. And having this structure in place with the UN as the main off-taker of the power plant, we were in position to distribute electricity to a broader number of off-takers and gradually sort of increase the investment that we can make in these power plants by expanding the solar number of solar panels, etc. Because now we have like a solid sort of like financial structure in place. Another strategy is like building strong relationship with local stakeholders, including community leaders, state governments, federal authorities, and other key actors. And these relationships help us maintain operational flexibility and allowing us also to adapt to the changing circumstances more effectively. And last strategy is like really employing a conflict sensitive approach, being mindful of the context dynamics and understand your impact on conflict dynamics. And I think ensure that your project contribute not only to energy access, but also to the broader social economic stability is quite important, as mentioned by Rhoda. Like really trying to see how you can create new jobs, how you can, eventually create an ecosystem around renewable energy by providing trainings. It's quite important. And going back to the sort of like this unpredictability, in the context of Baidoa, we have signed an MOU with the previous state administration, for instance. However, the administration has changed, and we had to rebuild a relationship and renegotiate with the new leadership the terms of the initially agreed terms. I think this also require you to sort of find ways to move beyond sort of like the personality-driven agreements that is quite often in fragile settings. But for instance, getting parliamentary or cabinet approval for projects to ensure that there is a broader political backing up of the project, and this reduces the risk of individual leaders retracting from commitments. Last sort of like range of like issues is the institutional capacity and also challenges related to project implementation. I think in fragile settings, governments often lack the institutional capacity to effectively regulate and oversee renewable energy projects. Environmental and social impact assessments, which are essential for ensuring project sustainability, are not always systematically enforced and monitored. In Somalia, this is particularly problematic due to the environmental degradation and climate vulnerability of the country. For instance, land management, for instance, is a predominant challenge in renewable energy projects, and the land registry system often relies on a mix of customary and laws and practices, while international standards require formal documentation of ownership on land use rights, etc. So you have to sometimes, try to bring the international standards and play with this in the very local contextualized environment. In addition, for instance, the judicial systems in Fragile City may not be fully developed to handle commercial contracts effectively. And for instance, when we propose including an arbitration mechanism in our contracts, local stakeholders were unfamiliar with this concept and fear that potential personal reprisals, rising concerns that disputes could escalate to the International Criminal Court, etc. So this requires to invest a lot of time and resources in knowledge building and capacity building to navigate such risks. Yeah, so I think when we collaborate with government agencies to improve their capacity, we always try to sort of assume that there is not necessarily a knowledge of like the requirements that we have at the international level, and that we need to bring them to up to speed. Looking forward, I think in terms of conclusion. I think it doesn't only apply to Somalia, but to all fragile settings or context affected countries, conflict affected countries. While Somalia presents a significant nose risk, ranging from political instability to regulatory uncertainty and limited institutional capacity, it also offers great opportunities for renewable energy investment to transform lives and economies. And the same, as I said, apply in similar settings. And I think from an infrastructure and development and governance perspective, it is important to note that developing renewable energy infrastructure requires an upfront investment. So it means that the risk are immediate for investors and developers. And it's quite an important aspect, to keep in mind. The World Bank estimates that, developing project in fragile settings takes 4 times longer and cost 4 times more than in a stable environment. And most of the time, these risks are priced in, meaning that, the solar, which should provide a solution for affordable electricity in fragile contexts, tends to be very expensive. And I think it requires, and I think, that's related to the point, made by Rhoda, is it requires from policymakers to really, from an investor perspective, to increase the predictability by, providing strong regulatory framework, taxation, predictability, environmental and social, also solid frameworks, and at the same time create incentives. Because if you want to compensate the risk, taken by the investors or the developers, you need to create an environment, favorable conditions for the investors to believe that you have the full backing from the different stakeholders. And this really, reinforced the need for a tailored approach in fragile context, meaning that, based on our lessons learned at Cube Energy, you need to be very mindful of the context, understand the stakeholders and the environment in which you operate. Any infrastructure project requires a strong community engagement and a close collaboration with local stakeholders. And you should assume that this is not business as usual. Traditional approaches may not work in fragile settings. It requires flexibility and adaptability. And two other points is like invest in local capacity. I think this is quite important. Capacity building is essential because you should not assume that your counterparts will have the necessary knowledge or skills. And last point is it's about the importance of debunking the misconception about operating in fragile settings and the risk of operating there. We need to sort of contribute to a narrative shift, from challenges to opportunities. And I think this is where, bringing, policymakers and private sector together is quite key. I'm going to stop here. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Kristen, for a very interesting presentation. I actually did have a question related to your last point where you said debunking working in fragile settings. So I wanted to know if when you are looking at assessing viability of projects, what types of potential disaster and conflict risk do you face or experience when it comes to renewable energy development? And do you do any kind of disaster or conflict sensitivity mapping before you go? How is that integrated in your process? Thank you.
And thanks for the question. I think, absolutely. I think when evaluating the viability of a renewable energy project, in fragile settings, we always take into account not only the technical and financial aspects, but also the potential risk related to both natural disasters, climate risk, and social and political conflicts. So some key risks we consider include mainly, I think, I related to that in my presentation, but the land use conflicts. These are often a significant concern in fragile settings where land ownership may be governed by a mix of customary and formal laws. And to address this, we assess local tenure systems, engage with local leaders early on to assess the actual historical use of the land and to ensure that the land use agreements are transparent and equitable. And I think related to climate risk, for our solar project, we assess climate risk, including the vulnerabilities such as extreme weather events. And I think this influences the type of technical solutions that we include and we provide in the design of the system. For instance, because of the water scarcity, in the city, we plan to use wastewater from the UN compound to clean the panels of the power plants. Another one, we use gabions filled with stones instead of cements, foundation for the mounting structure. And this is based also on an assessment of the availability of local materials that we can use, and if this has an impact on either on the conflict, on the way market operates, but also on the social dynamics.
Thank you. I actually do have a follow-up question, but I'm just going to wait for the rest of our panel members to come on board so that we can start the question and answer session. So I'll go over to you, Rhoda, before I follow up with Kristen. And I wanted to ask, you'd mentioned best practice, and are there any existing best practices within the region with regards to legal and regulations that support renewable energy development?
Right. Thank you very much, Sadika, for that question. In the region, when you look out, we find Kenya to be quite in the sub-Sahara region to be doing quite reasonably well with the legal and regulatory frameworks. There's a energy policy in place. The fiscal policies also seem to be working. The private sector seem to be coming into this space. It's a space in most countries we find that the private sector is not venturing in. But somehow Kenya is managing to attract the private sector here with the policies that they have put in place. So if I would go on top of my head, I would go with Kenya, and I'm sure Mr. Kihara here would be able to provide more details on the specific policies that have worked out very well in that country.
Mr. Kihara, did you want to address this?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Rhoda. Yes, we have seen, for example, the feed-in tariff policy. That has really attracted a lot, especially in renewable energy space. We have seen four power plants connected to the national grid. We have seen two power plants, like Turkana being one of them, connected to the national grid. And I also think the National Treasury, now this is another ministry away from energy sector, have provided what you call government support measures policy. This where, for example, things like sovereign guarantees, let of support, let of comfort come in. So government has been very supportive in providing the right incentives for private sector to invest in Kenya, especially in energy sector. We have seen quite a big leap of of investors coming from private sector generation. And using the same, we want to see whether we can have more coming in the transmission network. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kihara. I actually wanted to ask you. So, in your presentation, that you mentioned that there's almost like there's a long time between the drafting and the enactment of a law, and given that environmental energy as well as the relevant technology are very fast paced and fast moving, does the government have any plan on how do they plan for their acts to be stay up to date, given the long duration between drafting and enactment?
Now come to the Energy Act, enacting an act, as I said, takes quite a long time. So what we have in place is make sure we get it right in the first time, so that there is no very little amendment that goes to it. But the Energy Act, what it has done is provide for review of energy policy each and every 5 years. So we see this is done more frequently. Energy policy is done more frequently. The last one was done in 2018. So currently, the Minister of Energy and with the sector agencies are reviewing the policy to update or need to update the changes that have come in this environment. But in the same thing, we have seen government working on strategies. So, for example, we have a green hydrogen strategy. We have Kenya energy efficiency strategy that governs some of the areas that they're not really in the policy. So the government has come up with a way of make sure before we really change the policy, we do the amendments with the act, then we can be able to start working on some of these areas that are really key. A key one is energy efficiency strategy works on how we can develop our EV market. Energy now supports the transport sector by providing the right infrastructure, the right tariffs for the electricity that goes to EV. So, noting that the act takes a long time, so the government now comes with other ways of incorporating the changes that happen in energy, environment, and such areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kihara. Uh, Kristen, you mentioned something interesting where you said that uh, as you during your development you have to play with international standards, customary norms, as well as national judicial systems. So it suggests that given the lack of cohesive policy making, there is essentially, how do you navigate not knowing what to do? Is it very much you go there and you figure it out? What are the challenges that you face deve- developing in countries that really don't have any infrastructure or legal frameworks?
Well, I think that's a very good question. It's very context, based. I think, when you take Somalia, there is a nascent, sort of like regulatory framework in place, and they're now trying to develop the provisions to implement it. When you look at, Central African Republic, for instance, there is a quite a strong regulatory framework in place, but the fact even that the market on the energy sector has been liberalized since 2005, there have been no private operator there. So it means that it's more like trying to navigate what people actually never implemented in the past, even if there is sort of like some sort of regulation. But I think basically if there is some hesitation or there is a regulatory gap, what we do is we apply the IFC standards. I think both on the environmental and social aspects, and we try to sort of use sort of like good practices from the region. For instance, in Somalia, we use a lot of like what have been done, for instance, in Kenya, but also in West Africa, in Ghana, etc., where there is a regulatory framework that is well developed, and sort of like try to take these good practices to develop the project. And I think it's kind of a way for us to also help local authorities to build their own capacity and learn what's has been done in other similar, not similar contexts, but more like contexts that have like a pretty good experience. But also it's yeah, there's a lot of patchwork trying to navigate that. And I think for instance, for the environmental and social impact assessments, IFC standards was quite key. trying to really have sort of like an inclusive planning frameworks where we encourage, stakeholders to also be part of it. I think this is how we tend to operate, but it means that it takes quite more time. It's like it takes 3 to 5 years to develop a project strong enough for like investors to be confident to invest in.
Thank you. So now each of you bring a very different perspective from the development side, from the private side, as well as from the government side. And I wanted to know, in navigating this energy transition, how can you make each other's roles easier? So essentially, Kristen, what do you look for that perhaps Mr. Kehara's government could help facilitate? And Rhoda, when you are looking at different developments, how are you assessing them? So essentially, my question is an open question, is to the floor, is what can the other person or the other panel, what capacity gap can you fill, best suited to fill?
I can jump in first. I think I think what is important here, especially for fragile settings, is for them to learn best practices. And I think Rhoda's position is quite good in bridging the private sector and policymakers that have an experience. And I think there is definitely a space where we can share best practices and experiences, and also trying to find way of like practical ways of like building the regulatory frameworks that will sort of like create conducive conditions for investment. And I think Munga is like the best example that what you can do for instance in Kenya. And I think the proximity, for instance, with Somalia and other affected countries, South Sudan, etc. I think I think when it comes from the region, it speaks a lot, to the people and policymakers. And I think, this is, and I'm sure it has been done already. I'm sure, Mungai has already sat with, colleagues from other countries, neighbors countries. But I think it needs to be very practical. And I look at, experiences of like how you create conditions for investors to be like very comfortable. And I think there is incentives that have been probably implemented in Kenya that could be very relevant, to Somalia or South Sudan or other countries. And I think it needs to be like documented with numbers, data that will make them also on the fragile setting countries to be like, very eager to apply these experiences.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe Tadika, I can go. I can add to what Kristen has said. I think the strongest position for the UN, as you said, is bringing people together, sharing the best practices and data. UNEP can support this, not just the countries in the region. Of course, we can learn from each other, but we also learn that countries, for example, in Latin America and Asia, they've also been very good at trying to tap into some of the investments for renewables. So how best can we be able to support this? The other part we find that we can also support is data. A lot of countries are lacking data. We don't know why in Africa that we don't get data online, but it is a problem that we find with a lot of the projects. So, for example, if you're working with developers like Kristen, they need data for a country like Somalia or Madagascar and so on, and they're not able to find this type of data. You actually have to go in country to get it. So, supporting countries to actually put this data and understanding that it's actually good and important for them to put this data out there, I think that would be also very good. Maybe the other thing that would be interesting would be to learn some of these challenges that developers are going through. We do collect a lot of these challenges and try to talk to various countries to see how best they can be able to address some of these challenges and make them aware of the challenges that these developers are facing. Some of the policies and the laws that they have are actually causing a barrier for them. So we are able to sit with some of the countries and we can be able to discuss some of these challenges that they should be able to address. Also, there are development partners looking for various issues. We do also have, for example, we have focal point system. We have someone in every country, so we do understand the issues in the various countries and which development partners that maybe they can partner with to address maybe some issue that is being faced in the country. Thank you, Sadiqa. Back to you.
Yes, maybe Sadika can also add that in our development of most of these policies, regulations, and such, we have come out to learn a lot from private sector and also from development partners. For example, when it comes to mini grids guidelines, it's the development partners, no, sorry, it's the private sector that actually pushed us to develop the guidelines, sharing with us what has been done in other countries like Sierra Leone, Ghana, and such. Kenya has been developing mini grids using public resources, but now private sector told us we can be able to do this and also be close to almost the public tariff. So there's a lot to be learned from private sector, and I think the government what needs to do is really to listen from private sector. And what we have done is in our development of all the regulation that we have to do public participation and ask everyone to come on board and tell us this is what we have drafted. Is it the right way to do it? And part of it also to do what we call regulatory impact assessment. And this regulatory impact assessment the consultant because we don't do it as authority. We want some independent view of it. The main stakeholders, being private sector, for example, they have input on it and they usually share what other countries are doing. At the same place to development partners, because as Rhoda said, they are working in so many other countries, they're able to share what has been done in other countries. And we as Kenya, we can look at it and see, oh, is this really workable for us? Is this something that we can be able to adopt? This benchmarking has really helped us to come up with policies that really not only help us, our country, but also become like a light to other countries. Currently, we see countries like Djibouti, Ethiopia now very much interested in developing geothermal, considering our geothermal is in the Rift Valley, and Rift Valley passes through Djibouti, passes through Ethiopia, passes through Tanzania. So there's now an interest, and now Kenya has become a benchmark. And we have seen our officers from Kengen, from geothermal development companies, now going to build capacity in Tanzania, Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Djibouti. So this collaboration between private sector, development partners, and government, I think is very key in enacting the right policies, regulations, and laws. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the answer across the board. Actually, it really does highlight that to have renewable energy development that is also culturally context specific and effective, you kind of need every actor to. So another question following that is, what is the role of international partnerships such as like yourself in addressing infrastructure gaps and promoting gender sensitive in energy policies?
That's an interesting one. But we have in Kenya we have seen partnerships working for us. Our development, especially in geothermal, could not have been done if I think UNEP didn't come to assist us in doing the first feasibility study in 1956 around there. That helped us to come up with the first power plant in 1981. After we have put this on board, we have seen the private sector now coming in. And the private sector comes in where they have seen a good collaboration with especially other development partners, assisting us to develop the right policies that really attract them. Talking about partnership and now connected to the gender, USAID was able to assist Minister of Energy come up with the gender policy. The gender policy has assisted us in mainstreaming gender issues in all our projects. You see engineers sit down, just design a project, just and that do it the way they think it is the right way. But now gender policy has helped us to mainstream gender issues in how we do our project. And not only in our project, but also mainstream gender issues in how we do our things. Everything, including policy, including this regulation that we work on, all the strategies that we are working on, then we have a document that guides us on how we mainstream this in our operations.
Yes.
Maybe I
Rhoda,
can, I
and just,
can,
yes, please, any
yes.
insights?
So when it comes to development and support in the country, one of the areas in addition to what Kihara has said, is financing. We find that there's a lot of push on financing now, on climate finance. You go to the COPs, it's all about climate finance and so on. So when we look at the countries and how ready they are for this climate finance, this is actually where Africa is falling short. It's something that various development partners are willing to support. The UN is willing to support to ensure enough finances actually come into the region to support this transition. So financing is one of the places that they can support. Capacity building is also another area. We find that there's a lot of capacity on renewables with a lot of the development partners. So, for example, if you're doing wind, we have countries in Europe that has a lot of capacity in wind. For example, we have worked with Denmark, and they're able to support some of these countries to understand better, to build their capacity so that they're able to invest in some of these resources. On gender, this is something that we're required to have in I think all our projects now. So there's always a gender component to try and mainstream gender and ensure that as we move to the renewables, the girl child or the boy child or whatever vulnerable group is not left behind, that there will actually be jobs for them. They have the capacity to actually take up some of these jobs, implement some of these jobs. The working hours are reasonable depending on the care work that they have at home and so on. So this is something that is being integrated across the board, and it's something at least we're enjoying to see coming up, and a lot of projects actually are required to have the gender component.
Kristen, any insight on gender sensitive energy policy making? Or
I mean, not much to add with what I already said about this. I think, we look at it, in a way that both in terms of job creation and opportunities, and also making sure that, if we hire, a woman in the workforce, that there is conducive conditions for them to actually work. And I think the emphasis is more actually also on the construction and operation phase, where we establish, grievances, mechanisms, etc., to make sure that, we don't have a negative impact on vulnerable groups, including women, especially, when you bring, a workforce from outside of the city, etc. When you touch on issues like GBV, etc., it's quite an important aspect of the construction and operation of the plant.
So actually, I think all three of you touched on this aspect, and I think Kristen used the term an ecosystem. And Mr. Kihara, I think you said that you need to have water for agriculture before you do for perhaps green hydrogen plant. So not just the energy policies, but what do you think is a nexus or a network of supportive policies, whether that's job creation, that will enable the energy transition? So not directly the energy policy, but anything that's environmental or socially related that could really impact this ecosystem of energy. And this is open to all three of you, so please.
Let's go, Sanik. We have seen energy now playing a key role, being at the center of quite a number of sectors currently when you talk about transition. Sometime back, we were not really talking much about the green hydrogen, but we have seen energy can really enable through green hydrogen and ammonia to create jobs in agriculture. A good example for Kenya is that Kenya imports most of its fertilizer, and it's not in Kenya's agricultural economy. It means it imports a lot of fertilizer. But you have seen with green hydrogen and ammonia produced from green hydrogen, and we're talking about green hydrogen that is produced from renewable energy with a lot of resources from wind, solar, and geothermal. That means Kenya has the right resources to be able to produce green hydrogen, and with that, green ammonia. This green ammonia can be utilized in making of fertilizer. What does it mean? It means we are able to set up our local industries on fertilizer. The subsidies the government gives currently on fertilizer can now be channeled locally, and that means our young people will be able to get more jobs. our vulnerable communities where, for example, those geothermal where it's found is quite a marginalized area or we have marginalized communities in this area, be able to get jobs and be able to do other economic activities because wherever there's an activity going on, it has the fallout to other areas. So we will see energy now being almost in the center of this. And talking about the same, in the rural areas, we have seen providing energy for water pumping through renewable energy has also grown those areas to be really big in that sector. So it's something energy is really playing, and if we able to put the right policies that really help not only rural areas but also marginal communities, and also growing the industry, then the right workforce, our youth will be able to get the right jobs and be able to grow economically. So that's how I look at it. For example, when you look at green, as an example of green hydrogen in this case. Thank you very much, Sadika.
All right. Maybe I can jump in after Mr. Kihara. So on our side, what we find when we look at energy, a lot of the issues come in the energy, water, food nexus. So we need the energy to be able to get the food for the increasing population in the continent. As Mr. Kihara said, agriculture is one of the areas that actually would thrive a lot from getting sufficient and reliable technologies. So, for example, when we do, for example, direct use projects, direct use geothermal projects, this is where you look at the greenhouse, the climate smart agriculture, the greenhouses, the pasteurization, how to preserve the food, how to store the food. Can you be able to transport the food, for example, in energy efficient trucks and so on? UNEP does have a clean cooling project in Rwanda where they're training on some of these efficient technologies and how Africa can be able to take this up, especially for food security. So food security is really high up on the agenda there for countries, and climate smart agriculture is one of the best ways to address these issues in Africa. So investments in renewables, especially to address this issue, is really a big drive when we talk to most countries on the ground. Thank you.
And I'll quickly jump in. I think when we look at this nexus on our side is more the peace building and energy nexus, and how providing energy access can actually contribute to peace building development, and also provide opportunities, social opportunities and economic opportunities. And I think when you look at the overall framework that is in place, including IFC standards, what is missing, I think, in my opinion, is the S component of the environmental and social governance framework. And I think the S is quite light. And I think this is where you need to really provide quite a strong support to integrate, conflict sensitivity approaches in the environmental and social governance framework. And I think this comes with I think really make sure that the environmental and social impact assessment are well done. That this includes conflict assessments, also an inclusive planning frameworks that ensure that the energy project do not marginalize any community or group. Dispute resolution mechanisms, I think it's quite key as well. So you have to have regulation that establish transparent and accessible systems for resolving disputes related to lands, project ownership and compensation. And lastly is like so kind of like a benefit sharing agreements. You need to make sure that there are legal frameworks that ensure local communities can directly benefit from renewable energy projects, either such through job creation or profit sharing models, or any models that can work. Also meaning that you make sure that there is definitely an incentives for the communities and benefits.
Thank you so much. My last question to the entire panel. Rhoda, you very helpfully highlighted some insights for implementation challenges. You said things like execution challenge, infrastructure debt, finance issues, policy regulation, and complex landscapes such as fragile countries. Now, for each of you, which would be the first and the primary issue to tackle if you had to isolate and only choose one? Because it doesn't seem like you would be able to tackle all. So what would be your primary concern? And Rhoda, why don't you start us off?
I think it's very difficult to pick one. They are interrelated. But if I would choose one that I'm seeing is the biggest problem right now, is the debt burden. So the financing is a big challenge for a lot of the countries, and addressing the debt burden is really high on the agenda for a lot of the countries.
Thank you. Christian, Mr. Kihara?
Yes. As Rhoda says, it's really difficult to touch on one. But what looking at it from the government side, resources are very key for us to really progress in most of these things. Not only on projects, but also on the regulations that we are doing. As I said, doing a real impact assessment and also doing public participation is really, really expensive affair. So resources becomes very key, and these are very important for attracting investments, for example, or putting the right environment for everyone, including the private partners, to grow our economy. Thank you.
And on my side is predictability. I think, capital and technology are available for renewable energy projects, and that's not an issue. But what is lacking is bankable project. And in the context of fragile settings, I think uh, investors requires predictability to be able to actually make an investment. And I think this comes with, a very solid regulatory frameworks and incentives that can actually promote investment.
Thank you for such an interesting panel. And what I found the most insightful was how each of your roles feed into the other. How, Kristen, you do need laws and regulations to have greater predictability, and how, Rhoda, your work does create and center around giving them the data to have that predictability. So it's been really fascinating, and I would invite all of you to share one key takeaway from our discussions today. Um, Rhoda, why don't you go start us?
All right, I'll go ahead. I think the main key takeaway for me here is that advancing in renewables is really possible in Africa. We might find the environment very challenging, but I think we are tasked with this task to find a solution to actually advance on renewables in the region. Thank you very much, Sadiq.
Mr. Kihara.
Yeah, sure. I think my insight was here is that the right policy regulations and the legal framework is very key to develop our renewable energy sector. Taking consideration it have abundant of it in Africa, and with the same energy becomes now an enabler for all other sectors. So if we're able to do it right in energy sector, we'll be able to grow the other sectors. Thank you very much.
And finally, you, Kristen.
Yeah, I think, renewable energy can be a cornerstone of development in fragile settings, helping, to build resilience and foster long-term stability. But the private sector cannot do it alone. And I think, most of the time people think that, the private sector should be in the lead. But I think, it requires, policymakers, international organization, and regulatory bodies to make it work.
Thank you so much. Thank you for contributing to our panel and for providing such a brief, such interesting perspective. So we're really glad to have you here, and thank you for your contribution. Before people start signing off, I just wanted to remind you that you will get an evaluation survey sent to your email. If you complete that certificate, the evaluation survey, you will get a certificate of participation. You will receive it within 10 days of completing the evaluation survey. Now, I know many of you have attended our previous 2 webinar sessions as well. So if you complete all 3 feedback surveys, you get an additional certificate that says that you've successfully completed our global webinar series 2024 on key considerations in the energy transition. As you have attended the webinar, you will also now receive our monthly newsletter. Please also find the link to our LinkedIn page in the chat. And final reminder that this webinar is recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. But I will also be sending all our participants a follow-up email, which will include a link to the webinar, All of the presentations that have been shared by our panelists will be included in the email, as well as the link to the evaluation feedback form that you could send. So thank you so much for joining us, and it's been a very interesting discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.